at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. Charles Moscowitz here. We talk about religion, specifically Judaism, and its intersection with politics and with the state of Israel and with the state of the United States. Dooovid, you're talking about Heshi Tischler, who I've interviewed. He's a New York politician, kind of a bit of a rabble rouser, I'd say, in New York. What's going on?
Yeah, I mean, so it just in the Yeshiva News, the Orthodox Jewish blogs, and I saw that he got assaulted, and looked like someone he had a confrontation, came to his house, and I don't know if they argued him, and he hit him a few times, and he called the police. I don't know if he was injured, and then he tried checking to the hospital later, and so it's a little bit unclear. I just thought that you had spoken with him, and
no, but I'm going to give him a call. I mean, I'll find out what's going on with him, because, he's like out there. I mean, he's a very, very strong activist on New York issues, political issues, Jewish issues, freedom issues with regard to.
He's running for city council. I mean, he's like you. He's got a radio show.
Yeah.
Businessman, and yeah, so it's unclear. I think that in the thing it said that there were people that he said he knew from that had an argument at a Black Lives Matter protest, and I'm not exactly sure how they came to his house. And he said he recognized him. He started arguing with him outside of his house, and then the guy hit him a few times, and then.
Well, they've really become more vocally anti-Israel recently. I think that the head of Black Lives Matter made comments that would be viewed very traditionally as leftist type comments about Israel being a colonialist, imperialist, militarist, state. I mean, that has no right to exist there. So, I don't know if that's going to influence some of the, liberal Jews in my own town of Boston who have the Black Lives Matter signs on their lawns, but and I have a feeling it doesn't matter to them. But it's worth noting.
Yeah, so it would be interesting if you get him on again and see see. And he checked into my Monty's hospital. I guess I used to volunteer there, and I guess he got kicked out of there for recording. And I know the emergency room there was a mess, and sometimes you have to wait for hours, and it's hard to get information. Probably like any city hospital, you don't want to have to check yourself into the emergency room.
No.
But they probably not allowed to video it. That's probably policy internationally. So they kicked him out of the waiting room for trying to video when he tried to check himself into the hospital.
That's kind of a no-no to turn on the video camera when you're inside a hospital. He's the kind of guy that would do that, though. I could see that. He's a real, activist in the old-fashioned sense. Right out on the street. Interesting fellow. I wish him well, and I'm going to reach out, see if I can talk to him this week. I mean, early next week. I also want to thank Alex Newman from New American Magazine for interviewing me with regard to my book, The Satanic Conspiracy. That's showing some real legs. I mean, I'm getting book sales. I'm getting new subscribers on YouTube. He's got a pretty good show. I mean, he's got a going concern over there.
I watched that. I saw you tweeted that out. In fact, I just watched that right before we started talking.
I mean, I could do a better job. I'm looking at the thing, and I kind of feel cringy because, I'm very indirect. I don't want to say any, so I need to kind of sharpen up a little bit in my talk on the issue of the satanic influence.
Thursday night debate prep. I was telling people, like my friend Jennifer is like, you got to flow your debates. And then, people are arguing. It's then like, I learned how to flow debates in 9th grade. Like when I was on the debate team, it was the rule. Like you had to do it or you couldn't be on the team. And it's really important. I'm saying you're a grown man. You probably did as a kid, but even as a grown man to think about it, to how to most effectively communicate ideas, really flowing the conversations and debates is probably the best technique to improve.
It is, but I think that I feel hobbled by this little voice in my head saying, don't say this, don't say that, it's too controversial, I don't want to anger anyone, I don't want, you know what I mean? It's sort of, I remember when I ran for Congress, I had like a handler who would whisper in my ear, and all politicians have this, don't say anything about this, and don't say anything about that, because you don't want to offend this segment or that segment. And, as an author, I shouldn't think about that. I need to go in and speak my mind and do so clearly and succinctly and let the chips fall where they do. I need to improve in that way. And then when I look at that interview, I'm like, oh boy. Anyway, there's been a major election, of course, in the state of Israel, not an election, but a coalition that apparently, I don't know if it's definitely, but it seems that it has ousted Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, and it's made up of three. It's interesting. There are three politicians involved. I think that the head of the ticket is Naftali Bennett, who is seen as a conservative and on the right. And he's formed a coalition with this guy Lapid, who I think is a man of the left. And then the third partner in the coalition is head of the Israeli Arab Party. Dooovid, what do you make of it?
Yeah, I would tell you my conspiracy theories, but I think it's pretty awkward because what you just mentioned, the coalition between the Arab Party, which only has 4 seats, and Naftali Bennett, which only has 7 seats, is only 11 seats, and then there's another 50 seats in order to get over the necessary 61, and that's made up of blue and white, the Gantz and Lapid, and I think even the leftist parties like Meretz, and so it's really basically just a pure, we got to get rid of Netanyahu, and some sort of power sharing agreement that is almost nonsensical, because Naftali Bennett ran on the premise that he would under no circumstance form a coalition with the left. So Naftali Bennett is getting security because he's getting death threats from the own people that voted for him, who are threatening to kill him for forming a coalition with the left, and to make him the prime minister when his party only got I think 5% of the vote. And like I said, like Naftali Bennett was born in America, and we should talk about the 1996 massacre. Naftali Bennett is, from my understanding, he's the most prosecutable as a war criminal, and we'll go into it if you talk about the operation in Lebanon, where he was a commander, and this is the Israeli, when he became defense minister, there was complaints in Israel, but it was he went against command and went forward with a raid that his commanders didn't want him to do, and then they fired missiles at him from one of these truck missiles right outside of a UN base, and his group was getting shelled, and they called for backup. And this was in Lebanon, so it wasn't even like Gaza. It was outside of Israeli territory, in Lebanese territory. And then I guess the people who fired the rockets took shelter in this UN place. I mean, so Israel had warned all of these villages in southern Lebanon that they were going to bomb them, and they should leave their villages or seek refuge. And so there had been hundreds of people that had sought refuge in this UN place. And then they fired missiles from like a quarter mile outside of the base. But it was because Bennett was doing this mission that his commanders said that he shouldn't do. And then they ended up firing artillery at the UN base. And I think, killed close to 100 people, 70 people. It's possible or likely that the people who fired the rockets at Bennett's crew did try to take shelter in the UN base, but that's the most egregious, one of the most egregious, according to the UN war crime. I think for 10 years straight, the UN passed a resolution trying to get Israel to have to pay for it or recognize, and only Israel and the US voted against it. And actually war criminal charges. Like Naftali Bennett, I think, tried to come to Michigan a while back, and he wasn't able to because they're family members of the people in Lebanon that live here in Metro Detroit, and literally tried to bring a wrongful death suit. So it'd be awkward. I'm saying, if you say like, okay, Netanyahu got for like a war criminal or something like that, but like Naftali Bennett was part of something that clearly killed close to 70 non-combatants who were in refuge at UN residence in Lebanon not even in Israeli territory. And those people have family members all over the world. So it'd be extremely weird. And as I mentioned, that Naftali Bennett had tried to come to Michigan, from what I understand, and was stopped due to war crime charges, that they actually, Lebanese people had family members here that wanted to have them arrested and charged for war crimes. And so it'd be.
But what exactly? I mean, it sounds like, yeah. I mean, Naftali Bennett. What exactly was his side of the story? I mean, what did he say with regard to this attack? I mean, I don't think he meant to kill innocent people. I doubt that. I don't believe that at all. But he must have some kind of a military explanation for why he felt the need to fire a missile at that building.
Well, unfortunately, I mean, he was young then, and I mean, you see on Wikipedia, and even the Israeli investigation came out pretty negative, that that he was more aggressive than his commanders. So he wanted to go in, and the exact how the Israelis basically put it, that he went on his own accord without the permission of his commanders, went in to try to hunt down extremists, people where the rockets were being fired, and then he came under rocket fire and called for backup, and the backup ended up hitting the UN base in southern Lebanon. And so the Israeli records say Naftali Bennett never took responsibility. He claimed that the UN probably had something to do with the rocket fire, and even the Israeli investigation said, I mean, they never gave the names, but the Israeli investigation released that they did say basically racist things against Arabs, that they were said, like, don't do this, and that he had said, like, they're just a bunch of Arabs, so that's even the Israeli investigation.
And this was Naftali Bennett saying that.
No, there's the Israeli investigators after
they found that Naftali Bennett had made those kind of comments.
I think he still does. That's why I say that it'd be. I think it'd be a disaster. I mean, to some extent, like, okay, he's a smart guy. He's a self-made millionaire. He's a tech guy. But he is by far, from the senior Israeli ranking people, the most extreme. He was part of a mission that killed almost
terrible,
unquestionably, and he is
not a good representative of Israel. I mean, I don't know the details of this. You do. I'm not in any way doubting it.
I just looked. I mean, it was in 1996, right before. I mean, he was only in his 20s then, and this is
it sounds like he was also insubordinate. He was like going against the command, and he was on kind of like he was hot dogging it. I mean, he was on like a mission himself. He made a unilateral decision to do this, and I don't think that he meant to kill innocent people. I don't believe that, but as a military matter, it seems like it was very wrong, and it was certainly against Israeli policy. By the way, Israel generally, when they do something like that, if they feel that they have to, as no other resort, bomb a building, which was the case recently in Gaza, they usually give a warning to people in advance that they should clear out because it is a military target. And you're saying that he didn't do that in this case. He just went ahead and fired the missile at this building.
Well, he called for back, and so Israel said it was completely a mistake, that they didn't realize it was a UN compound, and they admitted that they hadn't meant to do it, and they gave certain reasons why it was a mistake, although they still rejected, saying that they had fired missiles from, less than a quarter mile away from the UN compound.
So there was no evidence that UN compound had missiles or was being used or was housing terrorists. It was just.
Well, it's possible that the people who had fired the missiles took refuge in the compound, that they fired the missiles from right outside of it, and then
they went in there as a way to kind of blend in with the innocent people, which is something that, by the way, I mean, we should note is a typical tactic of certainly of Hamas. I don't know about in Lebanon, but they do tend to find shelter with women and children, and they do tend to fire their missiles from places like hospitals and where there are people. They use them as shields, and I do think that was going on in Lebanon. Now
this is much different though than Gaza, because it wasn't in so to say Israeli sovereignty. It was in Lebanon. It's a questionable battle whether Israel had the right to invade Lebanon.
Oh yeah, no, it was a very controversial thing, and it I would argue it was a pretty big mistake for Israel to do that. What were they thinking? I mean, they're going to occupy Lebanon. I mean, I think that goes back to Begin.
Well, I
And
mean, they were firing they were firing missiles from that area into Israel. I mean,
well,
that wasn't.
Israel
I mean,
could
that
have
was
handled
obviously
it.
what they were thinking. That whatever caused the escalation, there were a few missiles that came from
Sure, but
Lebanon, and a
Israel
tit
could
for
have
tat
handled it without occupying
escalated.
the route. I mean, they could have handled it and they had allies in southern Lebanon. They had the Haddad and the Lebanese Christians, whom they abandoned when they withdrew from southern Lebanon. The point is, they could have created a reasonable buffer zone, a cordon sanitaire in southern Lebanon. But I think that, I feel like I shouldn't even, what do I know? I'm here in Boston. I'm just some schmuck, looking from the outside. But to me, it looked like they went overboard by going in and occupying Beirut. It was not necessary. And it was overly aggressive, which brings me to my thoughts.
Because I made these points the last few weeks that like the polling in almost 50% of Israelis possibly favor expulsion. It could be that that's why Bennett is becoming prime minister, because that is to some extent how Israelis feel. And it's saying Bennett never apologized for it. Bennett and his backers, to some extent, think he's a hero. And
But
so
he only
I
has
think
5% support in Israel, you say, in the Knesset. He's not well supported, not well liked.
well,
And
I'm
he's
saying
now
that
made a coalition with the Israeli Arab head politician in Israel, and with Lapid, who is on the far left. So, I mean, it seems like it's very strange. But I just want to comment also on that. People really seem to dislike Netanyahu, and I get the fact that he's probably been in there too long. But I think that this is an American talking, looking in from the outside. To me, it seems like he's been a very solid and able prime minister. I mean, he's resided over an economic boom. He's modernized the economy. He's reduced regulations. You've got the startup nation. You've got on a national security standpoint, he's been pretty moderate. I mean, he hasn't done like Begin marching in and occupying Lebanon. He's responded cautiously and moderately to genuine threats to the national security, and he's done it for over a 30-year career. So, I mean, I get the fact that maybe he's been in there too long, and it would be good to see someone else. But I don't get this anger and this portrayal of him in this villainous way by Israelis. I don't understand that.
Well, I think you're inaccurate. I think that, like I said last week, that Netanyahu said that he did not go into Gaza only because the Americans begged him not to, that the vast majority of Israelis thought they should. And like I said, Netanyahu will be that, conspiratorially, if it's here in the US that are keeping Netanyahu in power, the reason they're keeping him in power is because he'll be replaced by someone further to the right. So if you see Bennett, one of the biggest critics of Netanyahu, one of the biggest critics of Netanyahu right now for not going into Gaza and for being weak. That in America, Netanyahu is criticized as a war criminal, and in Israel, he's criticized for being weak. And just the
Netanyahu.
dichotomy of the difference between
Well,
how
look, I mean,
Israelis
maybe he
and
was.
American Jews look at it.
It's a controversy. Israel has to live with a hostile neighbor that keeps firing missiles and terror tunnels and gas balloons over the border. And so, yeah, maybe, from looking at trying to think about an Israeli living in Ashdod or Ascalon, it is weak. They want to see him finish the job with Gaza and take out Hamas. So yeah, that's a legitimate political question, but in a way, it reinforces what I have said in that he's always been fairly moderate in his defense of the national security. He's defended Israel's national security, but he hasn't done it. He's done it with the minimal amount of, of a heavy hand. I mean, at least, unlike what some people would like, and maybe he's wrong about that. But how is Bennett, if he becomes prime minister? I mean, how will he be able to operate with the troika, as it were, the Lapid on the far left, and the Israeli Arab head? I mean, he's not going to be able to do any of these things that you're talking about. I mean, he wouldn't have a hand to do that.
Yeah, I mean, just a disaster because it's really just a power share where they're promising gives to the other people, and the only reason people on the left, there's no path to a coalition on the left. So, Lapid and Gans, who have quite a few seats, like the left, has 30, 40 seats, but there's no path to a coalition. So they had to basically offer the prime ministership to Bennett as the only path to possibly oust Netanyahu. And just procedurally, that
So they
um,
just all they care about is they want to get rid of Netanyahu because they figure maybe a little down the road then they could knock off Bennett. Is that it? It's kind of like he's like the Kerensky. They figure Lenin. I mean put him in as a weak figure, a transition figure. I mean the left even viewed FDR that way when he first became president. They'd support him because then they could put in their guy down the road and he'd be this sort of weak straw, this intermediate figure who wouldn't have any actual political power.
it
Is
just
that,
I say procedurally that I think it's 12 days before it could be ratified. And right now, the Speaker of the Knesset is a Netanyahu appointee, and he's dragging it out. So they want to they want to force a vote to get rid of the current Speaker so they could hurry it up. But if any point within the next 12 days, Netanyahu could get defections from one of the parties, then the coalition will fall apart. And the most likely place to get defections are going to be from the few right-wing parties that are in the bloc, like even Bennett's own people that are.
so the right wing parties will then defect to Netanyahu. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, that's what Netanyahu said
Okay.
that so don't be so sure that they are going to form a coalition.
Sure.
And I mean, I've been saying, like, is Israeli politics really a mess in is like a constitutional convention? I saw, I didn't see that conversation you had with Mordecai Kedar, but you're saying even a scholar like Professor Kedar is really saying that Israel should have a completely upend and change its nature from however it was set up to a confederation. And so I'm assuming someone like Professor Kedar is saying that the current system in Israel is completely unworkable and broken, and they need to have some sort of like constitutional convention and restructuring of the whole government. And I'm generally in agreement with actually Kadar and his Confederate plan. That's I think
Yes.
that's probably the best idea. But unfortunately, that would require completely changing the Israeli constitution and system. And if you can't get a coalition, even have a prime minister, how are you going to get a super coalition to change the the whole system? And then really Bennett is really just going to be a strong man. You put him in, and so if there's also a problem. So if Bennett does get in and the coalition falls apart, you could have the same situation with like Netanyahu with Bennett, where there keeps on being elections, and Bennett will be the prime minister going forward until they could figure it out. And God forbid that could be a disaster, because they're saying he is a strong-hand man that had basically been calling Netanyahu weak militarily, and saying that he will be a real man, and then also saying that he has credible cases against him for war crimes, and saying that the prime minister of Israel directly involved. Like, okay, Netanyahu, like you say maybe he's not the greatest guy, but Bennett was literally directly involved in something that is largely considered a war crime by the international community. Probably wouldn't be able to travel. I mean, from my understanding, Bennett can't really travel internationally because there's so many Lebanese people related to the people that bring a wrongful death suit. I think it was even in Boston, one of the Israeli seniors that was part of the artillery was teaching in university in America, and they tried to bring war crime case against him, and America extended diplomatic immunity and said that they couldn't bring war crimes. It was literally an American citizen
Mhm.
that's a direct family member was killed. But from my understand, there are family members of these Lebanese people in most major countries around the world.
Okay.
So like if Bennett did become the prime minister and tried to do anything or travel, be a diplomat for Israel, there would be these Lebanese family members that would probably still be trying to bring war crime charges against them.
Yeah, no, it's very troubling, and maybe rightfully. I mean, it sounds like he was way off base. You know, he was insubordinate. He was going to take kind of doing like a cowboy move, and he bombed a building and didn't give proper notification. And yeah, I mean, it's very bad news. You know, this isn't the type. And now he's going to be prime minister. Sure, I
well,
don't
and
think he
it's like,
represents-
just to add, it's because he speaks English without an accent. So say the reason Lapid can't be prime minister is because no one understands what the hell he's saying. I mean, he speaks English decently,
Well, I don't know. I mean,
but it's not like Netanyahu
let's talk
or
about
Bennett. And even if you took
okay.
like My Conspiracy, which is kind of just the intellectual thought experiment that it also mentioned the nuclear weapons. Bennett, when he became security minister in 2015, said that they didn't even tell him about the nuclear weapons. Maybe they did and he didn't know, but it's like even when he was security minister for Netanyahu, he said to the U.S. media that they didn't even tell him about the nuclear weapons. But some sort of U.S. propping up Israel, saying no. I mean, Bennett is going to become prime minister because he's a U.S. citizen and speaks perfect English. And also, if you saw the Lindsey Graham, and now Israel's going to petition for $1 billion in emergency military aid to restock Iron Dome. And like I mentioned, if it was Iranian long-term strategy that if the U.S. does not restock Israel's Iron Dome, Israel could be quite a bit in military trouble. And then, how dangerous is the Iran, where Netanyahu and Bennett are basically saying that if the U.S. Enters the Iranian agreement, that Israel is going to distance itself to America and possibly go on its own. And how credible is Israel that they're going to do it? But it's saying that's what these guys are saying. So if it's a bluff, what happens if they call their bluff and saying, God forbid, we're both Jews who love Israel, even if we're scared or don't like the people leading it. But it's saying those are our leaders there, and if they're making a bluff and it gets called, it could be a disaster. And then what happens if there's pressure and they don't replenish Iron Dome, and then Israel may not win the regional war in terms of Hezbollah, or if it was a long-term Iranian strategy to God forbid, destroy Israel, that the first wave of Hamas, like I mentioned, that it's actually a long-term strategy, deplete Israelis' military supremacy, get bad publicity in America so they don't replenish it, and then really strike Israel militarily. And if Israel is bluffing, saying like, okay, we don't need your help, America, and even if we have to fight Iran and all the Arabs by ourselves, we'll do it. So God forbid, what happens if Israel's bluffing and their bluff gets called?
Well, first of all, I don't think that there's pressure on Israel to have an English-speaking prime minister without an accent, because I mean, Yitzhak Rabin spoke with a very heavy accent, and as did Shimon Peres, I believe. I think Ariel Sharon, an even heavier accent. So I mean, I don't know if that's it. Maybe Golda Meir spoke perfect English because she was American, but I'm not sure that I think that's a real factor. As far as replenishing the Iron Dome goes, I think that has broad support in Congress. This is not an aggressive weapon. We're not talking about giving Israel, any kind of a missile. It's simply a defense weapon. It protected Israel during the last Gaza war because it intercepts missiles that are flying into Israel. So it would be really unconscionable to not sell those to Israel, and Israel's paying for them. It's not giving them any money. I mean, it's basically offering. The United States has the technology to build these things, and I mean, I can't imagine that wouldn't happen. I mean, that would be absolutely unconscionable because that is a defensive shield, and I think both parties and both sides are going to make that happen and should.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably, there might be some negotiation, and as of now, like Lindsey Graham is probably a right-wing hawk, and he doesn't want to just replenish Israel's Iron Dome. He probably wants to give Israel weapons so that Israel could attack Iran should they need to. So there might be some
Right.
sort of compromise, like we're just going to give you the Iron Dome and we're not going to replenish all
Well,
the.
and also in all fairness, I mean, I think it was Donald Trump who, in the last period of his presidency, arranged for Israel to receive the those bunker busters, and that was resisted by Congress. He got that through legally, and did it secretly. And Israel was able to, in the Gaza war, they were able to put a stop to the tunnels, what they called the metro in Gaza, where Hamas had developed a network of tunnels that's apparently, we're talking like 50, 60, 70 miles of tunnels and underground facilities. It's almost like an ant colony. And I think that, had it not been for Trump delivering those missiles as he was leaving office, Israel would not have been able to have fought that war well, and they very well could have lost. So we are talking about this is a serious assault. That war came to an end after Israel went in with those bunker busters, because Israel had achieved the upper hand. And so, maybe there might be some other kind of weaponry that the United States has in its arsenal, other than strictly the defensive weapon that Israel does need to defend itself. And that could involve aggressive weapons. And now I don't think Israel, I mean, who knows? But I mean, I can't imagine Israel having the ability to go to war against Iran. I mean, that to me, I mean, and it's certainly not alone, maybe as a coalition with Saudi Arabia and maybe some other countries that also would feel under assault by Iran. I hope that doesn't come to pass, obviously. But I can't imagine them doing that alone. That would be insane.
Yeah, I have a feeling that maybe anti-Semitism isn't really increasing that much in America. Maybe it is related to what's happening in Israel. And I had, just evidence, because I walk around as a Hasidic Jew, that actually anti-Semitism is really decreasing here in America. It might be even at the lowest levels, and the uptick, if it really is related to what's happening to Israel. And like when Netanyahu built the wall uh, between Israel and Gaza and the West Bank, I thought that was a horrible idea. And if it's unsustainable, saying the wall's got to come down. And I said that really for 15 years now. There's really no one on the Israeli scene saying that. And he's saying that, I mean, Israel doesn't really need that much weapons to handle Gaza or the Palestinians, because they're demilitarized. They need the weapons to discourage attacks from Syria, Lebanon, and Iran. And it could become, like, if it was a right-wing Trumpian, it would have been a right-wing coalition saying you're no longer going to have America and Western powers coming into the Middle East, but it's going to be America, Germany supplying weapons to Israel, Saudi Arabia, and these different forces. And what I mentioned is that, I mean, the reality of what Israel did in Gaza is probably only a minuscule compared to what Saudi Arabia has been doing in Yemen. And it would just be a disaster if you say that in order, because Iran is so against Zionism and the state of Israel, that the best we could do to help Israel is just going to be to give a whole bunch of weapons to Saudi Arabia, knowing that they've been, I don't know the exact numbers, but I mean, I don't people that have been killed in Yemen. And it's really looking pretty bad. And saying like, okay, we believe in God, and obviously we're both Jews who lived in Israel and love Israel. And from the Haredi perspective, like I said yesterday, that's the problem of Zionism, is that because there's a Jewish state and there's a war and we're Jews, those people were killed on our behalf. Those people fighting in Israel are fighting on our behalf. And so if you're an American Jew, it makes it very difficult to know what to do. And that's why I even mentioned why I thought the right of return might have to be canceled, because just as an American Jew, say like it's going to be very difficult to root on in like these military conquests in the Middle East. And if we don't, then the question, what's the purpose of the right of return? Why is Israel, going to all this pressure in order that, that these American Jews that don't even support Israel, could have immediate citizenship when, likely that the biggest obstacle to making peace with Palestinians is actually the right of return to Jews. That, that's why I keep on mentioning, because you're like two-state solution, all the, federation. It's a big issue that there's millions of Jews that could potentially move from around the world or America to Israel. And if Israel, gave up on that to the Palestinians, okay, we're just going to cancel the right of return and try to make some sort of peaceful Confederate coalition, that might actually work. So why was there some issue with Professor Kadara, who's actually looking forward?
I didn't. He's coming on next week. We couldn't get that scheduled, and that's going to happen next week. As far as the wall in Israel, it is supported by all sides, left, right, and center in Israel, the majority, because it's worked. I mean, unfortunately, before there was an adequate fence and wall, you had suicide bombers crossing into Israel and murdering as many Jews as possible. And that was at an epidemic proportion in the mid 2000s. That has come to an almost virtual stop. It's like 98% ended since Israel put in place the security on the Green Line that is absolutely necessary and morally right because of the nature of the assault against Israelis. The problem for the West Bank and Gaza, if they want to remove the wall, is for them to remove the terrorists who are among them, so that Israel no longer has to have the wall. They don't have it because they like it. They're having it because it's a reasonable and proper means of protecting the lives and the property of their own people, in a way similar to the wall on the southern border of the United States. The minute that Biden was installed, he stopped construction of that wall. And now we have one of the biggest human rights disasters in American history. It is not being reported fully, and it's going to get worse over the summer, so they have to report it a little bit. But you have a disaster of people coming over the border, all financed by Mexican cartels, and including children who are disappearing in this country, and who we don't know who has them, and other human rights disasters, not to mention the influx of drug criminals and other people. I think that we're going to rue the day on that one as the months move on and as this becomes more manifest. So walls do work. It's part of the national sovereignty of any nation. I mean, Tunisia has a wall on their border with Libya that is very solid because they want to stop criminals from coming in.
Detroit used to have a wall for blacks. I'm saying that, it's still around people here, but for decades there was a wall to prevent the expansion of blacks past a certain area in Detroit, and saying that, to the average American Jew, whether it works or not is
that's wrong.
Probably on tenable.
Black people
you're saying that the reason you need the wall,
the community. I mean, we're talking about. It's a matter of policing. That when you have criminals that are harbored by a certain group, and that they come in and they start murdering you, you have a right to expect that there's going to be a proper defense, and that means stopping them from coming in. That is a normal, natural thing. It's appropriate. Now, as far as the Yemen situation goes, I don't know a lot about that, but what I do think, I think you're giving perhaps only one side of it, because the Houthis in Yemen are fully backed by Iran, and that they are engaging in aggressive conquest of Yemen and possibly Saudi Arabia. It's a proxy group that's
it's exactly parallel to what's happening with Israel and Gaza, and actually the weapons are the exact same. It's the exact same weapons that are coming from America to Israel that are being used by Saudi Arabia and Yemen.
That
was the point I was making.
Iran financing and funding Hezbollah in Lebanon and Hamas in Gaza. They're funding the Houthis in Yemen. They're exporting their revolution, if you will, their Islamic revolution to to, basically terrorize Islamic countries. This is a part of the ancient battle between the Shiites and the Sunnis. Don't forget. I mean, Iran being Shiite, and there's a minority in Yemen that's Shiite, and that's where the Houthis are drawing from. And so, there's two sides to that conflict. It's more of a civil war. I don't think that the United States or Israel have a particular horse in that fight. We should stay out of it, I think.
I mean, we do. We took the side of Saudi Arabia. We're giving this exact same weapons that Israel is using in Gaza are the same weapons that Saudi Arabia is using in Yemen.
Well, I mean, I don't know if we should be involved in it, other than maybe that the Saudis, have a reasonable defense against Iranian expansion. That may be. I don't know the intricacies of it, but
probably just that they could afford to pay. I mean, when Trump went to Saudi Arabia in 2016, and he heralded, this huge deal, almost $1 trillion, I think, in weapon sales. Just that Saudi Arabia could write a check for $1 trillion that would cash. So America,
sure,
relatively the government, we need money, and weapon sales is really probably the single best source of our income. And I mean, for some purposes, and if you're looking, who could afford to write a huge check? Like Israel can't afford to write $1 trillion check in order to buy those weapons. Saudi Arabia could, though.
Yeah, and look, the relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia is pretty troubling. It goes back to FDR, who met with the Saudi prince on the deck of a boat off Alexandria in Egypt after he was on his way back from Yalta in February of 1945. And at that time, they signed agreements where basically the United States would become the protector, because the British were at that point not able, at the end of World War II, to do it any longer. So, and ever since then, every American administration, both Democrat and Republican, have supported the Saudis and have made deals with the Saudis. And it's kind of, it originally was under the context of the Cold War against the Soviet Union. But after the collapse of that, it does bring into some question regarding.
Agree. It's largely because they could write checks that cash. I'm saying there's not too many countries that could write checks that clear. And Saudi Arabia, like even Israel, can't write checks that clear like that.
No, they've got the huge wealth under their feet in the sand, which is called oil. So yeah, I mean that's right. So that's corrupting. Anyway, so or as my late grandmother used to say, anyhow, what we talked a bit about Israel politics. You mentioned that you don't think there's been a rise of anti-Semitism. I would tend to agree with that, other than to note that the usual suspects, the radical left, the pussy hat crowd, the International Answer crowd during the Iraq War, the Ruckus Society, Antifa, BLM, the usual, motley crew of leftists and their international connections. They're now a little bit more vocally anti-Israel, and I would argue as such, they are anti-Semitic. They're almost Nazi-like in some of their protests. And they further advanced, I wouldn't say they formed, but they have further advanced an unholy alliance with radical Islamist groups like Hamas. And that's troubling. I don't think that has really made any new inroads into the United States, unlike, by the way, some other countries like Germany and like Canada, apparently. But it's there, and there's an element of support for them among Democrats in Congress, particularly the Squad.
All those people supported Bernie Sanders. Even that anti-Semitism in America is relatively light, and it's why I said, does increasing anti-Semitism is historically the Zionist strategy, that the Zionist idea was that Jews didn't belong in Europe. And
so they wanted to increase anti-Semitism to help make Jews leave and go to
is it possible that
I don't know if that's
Israel
true.
is still using the same strategy? That's why I keep on mentioning the end of the right of return, and saying, like the right of return is somewhat based on the idea that Jews in America aren't really safe here long term, and we need the right of return. It
Yeah, but
can't
that
just be.
doesn't mean, so Dovid, I've heard that trope amongst anti-Semites. I don't know if there might be a kernel of truth to it, but I don't buy it really. I mean, that they wanted to foment anti-Semitism. I just, to me, very, at best, very questionable. Um, anyways,
And we saw that with
as far as the right of
the
return,
huge amount of
that's
Israelis involved in the alt-right, and even like Jared Taylor and
Jewish.
David Duke, that as Luke Ford said, the original American Renaissance conference was like 30% Jewish, and then you had the conflict that David Duke was there and got into argument with the Jews, and they ousted David Duke, not the Jews.
So you're
And
saying that the
even
Jews
Richard
are
Spencer,
involved
where
heavily in
his
the alt-right?
Hailgate, Richard Spencer's Hailgate, thing, that there was like 20% Israelis there, and even someone in the audience. You see the video of Richard Spencer right before he says that he takes a question from an Israeli that says he was an IDF veteran, and there was a debate. I actually helped set it up. The IDF rabbi calls himself Judaeus Maccabeus. Um,
Well, I mean, you're talking about maybe the same people that were followers of Maya Kahana and the Kach movement, which started out, by the way, I should mention.
Or it's like Bennett, Bennett telling, the former American that is saying, yes, David and Charles, you have no future here in America. Get with it. See that the things are collapsing, and move to Israel and become, not just a Zionist, like an American Jew who supports Israel, but to actually pick up and leave and move to Israel, and even demographically that.
I've heard that. I mean, I frankly, I've been in Israel. I've had pretty, I wouldn't say right wing, but very conservative relatives who have made Aliyah to Israel and who kind of said this to me, basically. They said,
Well, they still say that in France. I mean, Netanyahu himself went to France and said that to French Jews. In Britain, you've been hearing some people saying that. Why wouldn't
someday in the United States there's going to be a Holocaust against the Jews? You should get up, uproot yourself, and come to Israel. I've heard that. I don't doubt that. I don't know if that means that they're fomenting anti-Semitism.
Well, the JCC bomb hoax thing, even to say that when Trump came in and the original, anti-Semitism is increasing, and because there were these consistent threats for months against JCCs, and it turned out
it was an Israeli. I know that, yeah.
And I think also, that was really the precipice that started increasing anti-Semitism under Trump, was those bomb threats for months.
Yeah, and it was done by this Israeli young guy, this teenager, I think.
Who I don't think was punished. I said that Israel should, God forbid, execute him for treason. And I think he wasn't even, even to say that, that I don't even think Israel punished him.
Yeah, I don't know about that. But you make the point, I mean, to go to this, yes, sure, there's an element within the Jewish community that you're going to find is on the very far right, just like you find them on the very far left. Jews have been involved with extremism on both sides going all the way back. There is actually, it's an interesting subject. It's an interesting psychology there. But I don't think that represents the mainstream of Judaism or of Israelis. Yes, Israel wants to have people come to Israel. And yeah, there's a general attitude like it's the land of the Jews and come here where you can be free and you can be Jewish and you can be open and you don't have to worry about anti-Semitism because you have sovereignty. I get that. That's a basic part of Zionism. I don't think it's either right or left either, by the way. I think that's just part of the Zionist zeitgeist, which in a way goes to my contention that the idea of the right of return is something that transcends politics. It is a basic and integral part of the Israeli ethos, of the Israeli existence. It's the very purpose, it's one of the purposes why there is a Jewish state in the first place. It is the homeland of the Jewish people. It is the place of refuge where Jews from anywhere in the world, if they're being persecuted or for any reason, they know they can go and they can live their life as free and open people of the Jewish faith. So I don't think there's any likelihood that that's going to be done away with. I mean,
it was because the negotiation with the Palestinians is saying the people in Gaza, the 10,000 plus Palestinians, Rashida Tlaib here in Detroit, do not have the right of return. And just in negotiation, like Professor Kadar, if there was some sort of compromise with Palestine, and say either Palestinians have to have the right of return or they have to end the
No,
right.
I don't
I'm
think
not
that's
saying
right.
the main reason I'm saying they have to end the right of return is because the Palestinians, any type of agreement with the Palestinians, will either have to
No
give
way.
the right of return to Palestinians or will likely have to end the right of return for Jews.
No, I don't think that's. I
So
don't.
you think it's possible to keep the right of return for
Yes, I do.
Palestinians? I mean, keep
No,
the
I
right of
don't.
return for Jews,
Yes,
but have it continue to be discontinued for
that's right.
Palestinians.
That's been the policy of the state of Israel
And you
since
think that's
1948.
sustainable? You think that's
Yes, I do.
sustainable?
I do think it's. I think it's not only sustainable, but it's essential if Israel's going to exist as a Jewish state. Yeah, and I think it's been in place since 1948. It's a very basic tenet of Israeli society on all sides, and that yes, it is a right of return for Jews, and it's not. They're not going to open the doors and the borders for non-Jews, Palestinian or otherwise. It's that simple. It is a Jewish state, and as such, it favors Jews, and it rejects people who are going to in any way be anti-Jewish or anti-Israeli. So
Even
yeah,
though they came from the land, even though all the
even
people,
though,
even
yeah,
though
that's
like
right.
90% of the people in Gaza came from areas in Greater Israel.
And by the way, I don't think that that's even necessarily true. I think that if you look at history on that, and my source on this is Dr. Roberta Peters, um, that most of the Palestinian Arabs who are there today and who are even in Israel, they immigrated into Palestine around the same time that the Jews started immigrating into Palestine in the late 19th century. Before that, it was a very sparsely populated province of Turkey. You had some tribes. They were mostly Arab, of course, but it was not the big numbers of Arabs started coming in because of the influx of European Jews who brought with them technology and economy and opportunity and democracy. And they came in because they wanted to be part of it. They wanted to work. They wanted to take advantage of the opportunities that were being created in that hub. They came in there for the same reason that Central Americans and Mexicans want to come to the United States. I don't blame them. They went there to get opportunity. There was this new country, this new society being built by Jews where there was farming and industry and manufacturing and infrastructure. And so most of them do not trace their ancestry back. They were immigrants into the land around the same time that the Jews were immigrants into the land. So, I mean, that's just, I believe, a historical fact. Anyway, Dooovid, we have to wrap it up only because I've got, Gab and BitChute, they don't take the full hour show. So I want to make sure that I can download the program properly. What do you have coming up?
Yeah, so you're the only one I really talk still about Judaism in Israel. So I mean, I'm gonna have week 3 now of my Thursday night debate prep. So my streaming partner, Jennifer, was on Modern Day Debate, and I think she performed very well in the the interfaith, pantheism, atheism, paganism, and Christianity. She seemed to perform the best. Good performance. I think they're going to have her back on Modern Day Debate to debate atheism, and just like you, I guess, talking about Satanism and other more general topics that are because we're both Jews and care about Israel. That's what we talk about. But it's not our bread and butter, our day job. So I'm continuing kind of with these esoteric studying and delving deeper into spiritual topics. I think I'm going to have another debate coming up on the existence of the soul and maybe against atheists. And I think Jean-Francois Greppi, he had Jennifer on last night on Odyssey talking about physics and quantum
Great.
physics and
Is his
different.
program still on YouTube?
He is on a whole bunch of servers, so he does have YouTube, but he's tried to migrate away from it because
Okay.
he doesn't think long term YouTube
I
is
don't see
too.
him out there as much as I used to on YouTube.
Right. So Odyssey right now, there's a whole bunch like Trovo and DLive and
Yeah,
the
I'm on all
censorship.
of those. I'm on all of those.
The censorship at some level, keeps on going. So people migrate,
They
and
are.
then they,
As am I. As am I. I mean, I still do. I mean, yesterday, I mean, I did a program with Josh Bernstein that I did not run on YouTube because last time I had him on, I got a strike. So, but it's on BitChute and it's on Gab and it's on Minds and Rumble and all these other sites. And I'm directing people to my website, charlesmoskowitz.com, where I have links to all of the various stations, including the ones you just mentioned for, the Trovo and them that carry the show. So, I'm not putting everything up on YouTube now. They are censoring certain topics. We know what those are that you can't discuss. So I think that that's just what's going on in the whole industry. But I do keep YouTube as the centerpiece still. And if
yes,
I
I'm just
do,
doing kind of like science talk. And then,
yeah,
also the question is, can YouTube, censor you for knowing that you're doing things on other platforms that, that
well,
like,
I mean,
Patreon and these other servers that, have kicked people off, not due to their activity on that platform, but on other
it
platforms.
remains to be
So
seen, and they may ultimately do that. I mean, I will say that I will go on and say on YouTube, I'm interviewing so and so, and I can't do it here, so you'll have to go to these other links. But I'm not going to say anything about it because I know that it's banned on YouTube. But ultimately, that may happen. I mean, maybe they'll just ban you anyways. Who knows? I mean, all they need to do is press a button and you're gone. So, anyway,
keep the value proposition, say like, okay,
yeah,
like we're good Americans, we fulfill our duty. I'm an engineer and like a spiritualist and do interfaith, and I have my opinions about Israel and Judaism, but if it's too controversial to talk about, like I'm still an engineer and
well, I
have
mean,
opinions that to talk about other things, although it's less popular. And
you can't talk about, like, if I think it was about 6 months ago, David, I had a program that you and I did that was taken off of YouTube. I mean, they said that we would engage in, I don't know, I assume anti-Semitism. I mean, here we are, we're both openly Jewish and, and loyal Jews and, at reasonable levels of observance. And we're taken down for this. So, I mean, that it's not, there's something that's, if you don't mind my saying, very unkosher going on.
yeah,
So,
we saw it. I mean, we I'll let you end because but Google, where they had the diversity officer that had a tweet from 2007 and they're moving him, and I think Facebook, they just said they got rid of Sheryl Sandberg and replacing him with some guy Levine, and also YouTube is, I think they might, kind of like bait and switch, where they were, it was freemium and they were letting everyone do stuff for free. And I think that YouTube is likely to just keep on getting rid of free features and making it more and more difficult to, like
right. Well, the
to work
business
with. And it
model is
might be
not
the model
right.
like Facebook and
Yeah.
technology, and could be good. Maybe they'll collapse and other servers will break up, or maybe
Right.
so it's a lot of uncertainty.
There is.
So I mean, I enjoy talking with you. I like my favorite topic, Judaism and Torah, and like talking about
Me
this
too.
stuff in Israel
Wonderful.
is probably one of the most important things. But at the same time, like, we're both educated people that have a value in what we know outside of these issues that we care about. And so we'll have to just see how it goes, and be careful,
Not my
and hope
hands.
for the best.
I mean, I try to avoid, the censored topics. Anyways, David, listen, thanks a lot. Talk to you next week.
Oh, you're great.
All right. Take care.